Could you actually double check the live stream to see if it is working?
Okay, let me check. I don't see any video.
Can you hear audio? Let's see.
Not really.
We can try. We should probably have done a dry run earlier. Let's see. Can you see my PowerPoint?
So I cannot see it on Zoom. Let me see if I can see it on
the live stream.
Just a sec. Ah, yes.
So you can see it on the live stream?
Yep.
Okay, perfect.
Except the dimensions are all messed up. Why don't you go into slideshow mode? Yeah, so it's not, the screen size is not correct, it seems like. I'm basically seeing, actually let me do something, just give me a second. Yeah, could you just go back to slideshow?
Let's see, does that work?
No, a lot of it is getting cut off.
Okay, let me try this.
Yeah, so maybe there is a screen size or screen resolution mismatch.
Yeah, I think that's probably it. Now, let me try something different.
There are 5 people watching now.
Okay. Can you see my Zoom?
I can see. No, I'm not seeing much right now. It seems like just a white screen. So I'm seeing a white cursor.
Okay.
The white hand.
Yeah, so for some reason it's not capturing. Let's see, can you show your video?
Yeah. Just a sec.
Okay. Yeah, you know what? I think it's a problem with this software. That's the problem with downloading the open source version.
Oh, yikes. Okay, so it's getting cut off.
So I'm not seeing anything, but yeah, you're not seeing anything, right, on the live stream?
The live stream, no, it's just a black screen. But a little while back, it was working. It's just that the resolution was off.
Okay, so let me try that again.
Hey Armando and Swarath, it's Nina. I just wanted to let you know, I think Assault Greenspan is also going to join, even though I didn't mention that before. And India may be hopping in and out. But our job here is not to do anything else except just listen. We are just observers. So feel free to conduct the meeting however you want to, and we will give you our feedback at 4:30.
Thank you.
Wonderful, thank you.
Okay.
Yeah, we are right now just trying to figure out the live stream.
Sure, go ahead. I will not disturb you. I'm just going to go on mute.
Sure. Yeah, so it seems like it's back again, but again there is this resolution issue. So did you have to set any resolution anywhere in this thing?
No. Let's see.
Could you change your screen's resolution to...
Does that work now?
Let me see. Just a sec. Okay, can you go to full screen?
Wait, so you're not seeing the full screen?
No, okay, hold on. Oh, yeah. So now it seems like there is a little bit of a black area on the right hand side. So you can even make it a little bit bigger, I think. But at least it's much better than before. Can you just go through the next few slides?
Okay. So it looks like it works.
Wait, can you go to the next few slides? Hello. Hi, Saul.
Hi.
Could you just go to the next few slides?
Sure.
Okay. Properly positioned now. Yeah. Good, good. So now the only thing we want to test is your voice.
Yes. So, can you hear me?
Maybe somebody else can try out also. No, this is looking great, but the only thing is So I can hear you fine. I just don't know if I'm hearing you through the live stream.
No, you know what? Why don't you hang up and then just check on the live stream, and then you can come back.
Okay,
and
will
tell
do.
me if you can
All right.
hear me. Hi, everyone. Looks like we're going to give another couple of minutes for everybody to start trickling in. But I hope everyone can hear me properly. Hi, everyone. So, welcome to our kickoff meeting. I hope everyone can hear us properly. We are just checking out some last-minute glitches with the live streaming of the talk itself, but it looks like the video is working well, but the audio not so much. So let me... Okay, that's running.
Who is the host of this meeting?
I'm the host.
Can you please record?
Can I record? So we're live streaming everything.
Oh, we're live streaming.
Yes.
Oh, great.
But
yeah, because I know last meeting was not recorded, and I was really sad about that.
Okay, so it looks like the sound is coming through. Hey, everyone.
Hey, Armando.
Hi, Armando.
Hi, everyone. So
Hi.
we're getting ready to start. We'll give it another minute or so for everyone to trickle in. But it looks like everything is getting ready. Let me do this.
Hey, Armando, it looks fine.
Okay, perfect. And then, can you see my screen right now?
Yep.
All right. So, let me get everything in place. All right, so welcome everyone to our kickoff meeting for the project. So the project actually got started officially back in April, and for a while we were hoping that we would be able to run a live in-person kickoff meeting, but at some point it became clear that that was not going to happen in a bit. And so the good thing is that now people all over the world can come and join us at our virtual kickoff meeting. And so I want to open by giving a little bit of background about the project and where we're coming from. So the title of the project is Understanding the World Through Code. And we have a great team of people who came together originally to put together this proposal, and I think you will see all of us over the next couple of days, and some of us trickling in and out of the video. I also want to point out that since we submitted the proposal and we started working on this, we also acquired two more proto PIs who have been collaborating with us fully in this project as PIs, even though they were not in the original proposal. But Chris Burge and Josh Tenenbaum have been really crucial and central to this project and to this effort. And so, before I tell you a little bit more about what the project is about, so the motivation for the project was that we saw, on the one hand, deep learning really transforming science and transforming many different areas of science. For example, even within the PIs of our group, for example, Wengong Jin is actually going to be telling us more about this effort tomorrow. But this was a project that got started with him and our co-PIs, Regina Barzilai and Tommy Jakulak, where they were looking at making predictions about organic reactions, right? And already very early on, they were able to achieve a level of accuracy that was significantly higher than what was achieved by prior techniques when it came to making these predictions. And they have been able to move on this research at really breakneck speed, to the point where a few months ago, in collaboration with James Collins and Jonathan Michael Stokes, for example, at the Broad Institute, they were actually able to demonstrate a structurally new antibiotic. You might have heard about this in the news, but it's just a little piece of evidence of the kind of very powerful advances that deep learning is making possible in many different areas of scientific exploration. However, there was also a sense that when it came to applying deep learning by itself, something is missing, right? And in particular, when it comes to really building up our scientific understanding of natural processes, for example, interpretability is really crucial, right? It's not enough for the neural network to be able to understand a process. We want to be able to understand that process. And not only that, there's many domains in science where data is plentiful, abundant, where we are drowning in data, and the kind of possibilities that you have with deep learning to learn from very large amounts of data make a lot of sense. But there are other settings where collecting data is actually expensive, and where we would really like to be able to bring in more domain knowledge, more of our prior knowledge about some of these underlying processes in order to be able to learn with more data efficiency. And this question of prior knowledge is really crucial when it comes to scientific understanding. It's not enough to be able to get a ton of data and train a network and hope that it's able to predict what you want. You want to make sure that the predictions it makes are consistent with what we know about the underlying processes behind many of these phenomena. And finally, being able to distinguish between correlation and causation, being able to tease out between things that are just coincidentally correlated versus things that are really having a causal effect. And so there was a sense that something more was needed. There was a sense among our group that something more was needed. And so, based on our background, we're also intimately familiar with another, arguably quieter transformation that has been taking place in computer science over the last couple of decades. So everyone these days is familiar with the way deep learning has transformed machine learning, and not just machine learning, but really many areas of computer science. But it turns out that formal method has been going through its own quieter revolution, where today we are able to reason about systems, reason logically about systems at a scale that was unthinkable 1 or 2 decades ago. And techniques to reason formally about code, for example, have moved from lab curiosities to commercial products that are out there discovering bugs in software that is used day in and day out. And this ability to reason formally at scale is something that has been very well exploited in the world of software. But one of the motivations for this project was that we could potentially leverage more of these for the purpose of scientific understanding. And in particular, we wanted to build on the success of a previous expeditions project, the XCAPE project, which really pushed program synthesis forward in terms of the scale of problems that it's able to tackle and the variety of domains that it's able to work with. So at a very high level, the high-level idea behind program synthesis is that you can combine together behavioral constraints for constraints on how you want a particular piece of code to run with structural constraints about how you want a particular piece of code to look like. And by bringing them together and reasoning about the combination of these constraints, you can produce a piece of code that satisfies both of these kinds of constraints, right? And so these kind of techniques have demonstrated to be very, very effective in a variety of domains, from data structure manipulations to data wrangling. For example, one of the success stories in this style of synthesis is the flash fill technology that is part of Excel that allows you to demonstrate string manipulations with often one or two examples, and is able to learn small programs to do that based on that information. Now, very early on in the research that was pushed forward, even through the Escape project, it was observed that there was some potential for these kind of technology to be useful for scientific discovery as well. After all, the observation is that a lot of scientific knowledge nowadays is actually encoded in the form of source code, right? Scientists used programs to write models for a variety of phenomena today, right? And programs have many benefits. First, executability. The consequences of theories can actually be evaluated in silico through virtual experiments. You can also do interventions. You can modify the code and evaluate different alternative scenarios within the code. And if the code is written properly, what you expect to have is some modularity, that different parts of the code represent meaningful parts of a system. It enables probing at a level that is sometimes difficult to probe in the real world, right? And finally, interpretability, right? Code can be audited to ensure its consistency with our understanding of the theory that it is meant to represent. Now, one of the very early efforts in actually taking advantage of program synthesis in order to aid with scientific discovery was actually done almost 9 years ago, or almost 7 years ago, in the lab of Raz Bodic, my own advisor. There was this effort led by Ali Koskal, that was looking at whether you could leverage program synthesis to discover the mechanisms within the cell of a C. elegans swarm that was used for deciding the fates of different cells as this worm develops. And one of the key observations was that you could model regulatory networks with programs, right? The kind of messages that are sent from one cell to the other could be modeled by modeling suppression and activation networks, and you could model some of those with state machines. Moreover, the advantage of leveraging program synthesis to go from data about these interactions to a model that actually describes these interactions is that you could potentially go to a synthesizer and say, here's some data, generate me a model that is consistent with the data. And then you could also say, okay, and now can you generate me a different model that is also consistent with the data? And so, for example, in one model, there might be a step that is being inhibited in one way, and in another model, it's inhibited in a different way, right? And the synthesizer can now tell you that both of these are fully consistent with the data that you have available, and these alternatives that are all consistent with the data can now give rise to new experiments. So this work was really inspirational in terms of the ability of program synthesis to discover models of natural processes that could then potentially be validated against further experimentation. We ourselves, for example, in collaboration with Josh Tenenbaum and Tim O'Donnell in a project led by Kevin Ellis, we have actually also been looking at different kinds of models of a different kind of natural phenomena. In this case, we're talking about language, right? So, for example, in linguistics, people have developed extensive formalisms to describe the mechanics of language, the way words come together and the way words are altered and modified to form different forms of words. So, for example, if I tell you that I have a root of a word called open and that I want the past tense, you can derive that the past tense of open is opened. Right? Now, in this case, it's actually quite simple once you get past the funny characters that are often used to describe phonemes in this literature. But sometimes it gets a little bit more complicated. For example, if you look at the word walked, right? So you would think, based on a rule that says, well, you take the word and you add d, you would think that the past tense for walk should actually be walked. But unless you're learning English as a second language, you know that it's not walked, it's walked. Right? And now, why is that? Well, it's because there is another rule in the language, a phonological rule that tells you that whenever you have this KD sound at the end, it should really be transformed to a KT sound. That's why we say walked and not walked. So the challenge was, could you actually discover the mechanics of how essentially words are put together from a corpus? Could you leverage program synthesis in order to help you discover these rules? So the high-level idea is that from a corpus in a language that combines a particular form of different words together with some meaning information, can you reconstruct from that both a set of morphology rules as well as the stems of those original words that, through the application of those morphology rules, led to the observed and led to the observations, right? And so this is an instance where, again, you're taking data from the natural world. In this case, it's data that was recorded from native speakers of a language, and you are combining that data with prior knowledge of linguistics encoded in a program synthesizer in order to give you a theory for how a particular language works in the form of a set of rules. And so what we found is that you can actually come up with some fairly intricate rules. I don't expect you to decipher everything that is in this slide because the notation would take a little too long to explain. But the bottom line is that you can take a language like Somali and take a collection of words, and from those words come up with a set of rules, both morphology and phonology rules, for how these words are put together. And then from those rules, backward derive the stems and the sequence of transformations that word goes through in order to get to the final form that was actually observed and recorded from the data. And in the aggregate, what we can see is that for many languages, you can actually do this quite effectively. So what you see in this plot is on the order of, I believe it was 75 different languages, and comparing different variations of the method. The most important line to notice is the strong blue line that shows that for many of these languages, you can actually reconstruct 100% of the target rules based on an observed corpus. So these tantalizing results would seem to suggest that what we really need is program synthesis, right? That program synthesis is really going to help us push forward. However, if the problem was already solved, there wouldn't be a need to run an expeditions project. One of the things that you find is that these program synthesis techniques work well at the small scale, but scaling program synthesis is quite a challenge. The search problems that you have to solve in order for these classical synthesis techniques to work are actually quite daunting. And for many of these success stories, they require very careful encoding of the space of possible programs that you consider, and large amount of expertise in order to encode the problems in such a way that they will actually solve. So the big step forward that we're planning to make as part of this project is to bring together these program synthesis technologies with learning technologies to be able to get the best of both worlds. This by combining some of these techniques based on formal reasoning and some of these strengths of the programming languages and formal methods techniques that leverage modularity and data abstraction, and combining them with novel neural architectures, with numerical optimization, with better reasoning about probabilities and uncertainty, that you can actually do much better than what you can do individually with techniques coming from these two branches. And so that is really what we're after in this expeditions project. And so one of the key ingredients here, and the core technical the technical core behind these developments, is a set of new neurosymbolic reasoning techniques that are able to combine together these different styles of reasoning in different ways. So already we are seeing in the literature many different ways of combining neural and symbolic reasoning, many of those by people in this meeting, both PIs as well as many of our guests and collaborators. So you find, for example, very successful approaches that work by combining neural reasoning with logical reasoning in a pipeline. You start with a goal, you push that goal through a neural network to give you a higher level roadmap of the problem that you're trying to solve, that then makes it more tractable for the program synthesis techniques to solve. You also see a lot of neural guided search techniques where a neural network guides the search for a program-like structure, for a program that will actually solve the task, with the advantage that you can now train this neural network on a corpus of problems to be able to solve problems in the same family more efficiently. We also see a very successful application of program extraction, where you start by training a neural network, but then you extract from that neural network a more programmatic representation that is more useful and that satisfies more of the goals that we want to satisfy for many of these scientific discovery tasks. And finally, we see a lot of efforts that are really trying to deeply intertwine neural networks with program-like structures in order to give you a lot of the advantages that we want. So to give you just one example of the kind of techniques that I'm talking about, and Swarat afterwards is actually going to describe many more of these examples, but just to give you a flavor of what we're looking for, I'm going to focus on this problem of program extraction. So in a very recent paper led by Jivan Inala, and that actually involved three of the PIs in this project, Osbert, Martin, and myself. We're looking at the problem of generating interpretable policies for autonomous agents. Think drones that are trying to communicate as part of fulfilling a task. And the idea is that each of these drones starts at some initial position and is trying to get to a predetermined final position, but it has to coordinate with all the other drones so as to avoid crashing into them or creating bottlenecks as they're going from one place to the other. So the high-level approach is that you have three policies. On the one hand, you have for every agent a policy that the agent uses to determine what messages it is going to send to other agents. And you also have a policy that on the receiving end is used to determine how to combine the messages from all of these different agents. And finally, based on those, the agent is taking some actions, right? And so this is something that you can actually do relatively efficiently using a transformer network, right? And you can even look at the matrix from this transformer network and figure out the communication pattern that is going to be induced by this network, which drones are paying attention to which other drones. The downside is that while at any given moment you can look at these matrix and get a sense of who is communicating with who, it's much harder to get a sense of why the network chose this particular communication pattern. What is the network actually trying to do? And it's also because it's difficult to tell exactly what it is that the network is trying to do. You can often end up with a communication pattern that involves too much communication, where too many drones are sending messages to too many other drones. So our approach instead is to define a custom domain-specific language that is able to describe these communication patterns so that we can now, from this transformer network that was learned by the system, push a program synthesizers to give you an interpretable program that is going to describe the communication. And so what we find is that if we compare the performance of the program compared to either a fixed communication pattern or a transformer network or a decision tree, we can see that in these graphs, lower is better. Lower means that there's smaller loss. It means that you're able to communicate better. And so we can see that the transformer in general tends to do better than all the other approaches, but the program is not far behind, and it's certainly better than the fixed hard-coded communication pattern. Yet, if you look at the amount of communication that is taking place, how much communication is taking place for each one of these different goals for the desired agent, you find that the program, because you have a lot more control over the structure, you're able to enforce a much smaller amount of communication compared to many of the other techniques. And not only that, but you're able to get policies in the form of programs that you can actually interpret. You can actually tell that, oh, the rule that it is following is that it is choosing an agent in the direction of the goal, or that it's choosing to communicate with the closest agent to the current agent. We can actually plot, for example, the region that is defined by a predicate inside the program that says, I am trying to communicate with agents within this region that maximize a particular property. And so what we have is, by leveraging the structure of programs, we are able to get something interpretable and something that is more efficient to execute than the neural network. But at the same time, we're still leveraging the ability of the neural network itself to learn these policies efficiently and to actually give us a policy that works, instead of having to synthesize that completely from scratch. Right. And so, as I said, you will see more discussion over the course of these 2 days about the style of techniques and some of the different places where they can be applied. But I wanted to give you a sense of the kind of ideas that we are talking about. Now, so we want to leverage neurosymbolic reasoning to solve these scientific problems. In order to ground our research, we decided to focus on 4 different domains where we felt there was a combination of need and opportunity in terms of what could be done and what could be accomplished with this kind of technique. So the 4 domains that make up our project, and you will be hearing talks around all of these different domains over the next 2 days. The first one is organic chemistry. Organic chemistry is a domain where some of the prior work of some of the PIs in this project has demonstrated enormous promise, but where we believe there's a lot of potential for the kind of neurosymbolic techniques that we are developing in this program to make a big difference. The next domain is RNA splicing, and I will explain a little bit more about what this is, but this is a really important domain in terms of understanding a number of diseases, as well as just understanding how cells work. And we also have the domain of cognitive science and behavioral modeling, and the domain of computer systems, where even though these are not natural systems, this is a domain where once you get to the complexity of modern computing systems, whether you're talking about data centers or whether you're talking about individual CPUs, you are now talking about a system that, where arguably it is easier to reason about in many ways by collecting data about it and by analyzing this data and building higher level models than by directly diving into the guts of how the system works. So, as I said, organic chemistry is an incredibly promising domain. One of the things that makes organic chemistry challenging is this enormous combinatorial space of possible molecules that you could potentially construct, where in many cases, just a tiny difference in a molecule can be the difference between it having, for example, a particular effect in the body and having a completely different effect, right? And one of the big questions that we have is, can we design molecules with desired properties? Or, for example, can we take a molecule that has a desired property, but also some undesirable ones, and eliminate the undesirable properties, but preserve the desirable ones? Can you make it less toxic or more potent or even easier to manufacture, right? And again, in many cases, the challenge that you run into is that tiny differences in a molecule can lead to very large differences in its effect. The other challenge is RNA splicing. So back when I was taught biology in high school, I was taught this story about how you have these 2 strands of DNA that encode for a gene, and so then a piece of RNA is transcribed from that DNA, and then that piece of RNA travels to a ribosome, and out comes a protein, right? And one of the things that I learned in working on this proposal was that this picture was a lie, or more accurately, it was insufficiently precise, right? That in fact, in between this process of transcription and the point where you actually make a protein, the RNA actually has to be processed by the splicing machinery that is going to identify the parts of the RNA that actually have to be preserved and assemble together the piece of RNA that is actually going to be decoded into a protein. And this process of how this RNA is manipulated and spliced is crucial in understanding a number of genetic diseases, not only early onset Parkinson's and spinal muscular atrophy or ALS. It's also believed to play a role in some forms of cancer, for example. And so what we want is we want to be able to build models of these that take advantage of all the domain knowledge, that everything that is known about how these processes work, but that can also leverage data, the large amounts of data that are available about these processes. Another domain that forms the core of this project is cognitive science. So there's a number of questions that we would like to ask about, for example, how do children acquire symbolic concepts, right? How do they learn to count? How do they acquire the rules of language? How do they come to understand the laws of physics, right? And so if you want to understand this process of acquiring symbolic concepts, then you want a notation that is able to capture rich concepts about the world, that is able to capture some of the symbolic knowledge. And so one of the hypotheses that has been advanced by many people in the cognitive science area, most notably Josh Tenenbaum, as well as Noah Gutman, who are part of our project, is that you can model some of these things through programs, and that by leveraging the machinery of program synthesis, you can potentially come to understand many of these processes, even compare the behavior of some of these program synthesizers with the behavior of actual human beings, right? And finally, computer systems is another really important area for us. This is an area with enormous economic impact, where our ability to understand, for example, the performance characteristics of a computer system, and to understand it not just in order to make a simple correlation that says, for example, that gives you a black box prediction about the behavior of a particular program, but really understand it at a level that allows you to guide the optimization of a system based on this knowledge, is something that can potentially transform the way we optimize synthesis. And so in the next couple of days, for example, you will be hearing from Michael Carvin about some of our efforts within the project related to this area. And finally, I'd like to welcome, I've seen that some of you are here today, people from our industrial advisory board. So these are people who, on the one hand, have significant expertise in this intersection of machine learning and formal methods, but who also can provide higher level insights about based on their perspective from industry. And so to end, I want to give a little bit of a summary of the first 6 months of our project. So as I mentioned before, the official kickoff meeting of this project was on April 1st. And so over these first 6 months, part of the focus has been on building up those teams and building up those relationships that are going to allow us to push this project forward for the duration of these efforts, right? So on the one hand, there has been research progress in all the different directions of this project, and you will be hearing from some of those advances over the course of the next few days. To me, one of the things that has been extremely valuable are these brand new collaborations that really could not have happened without these projects. So, for example, we are now running a group looking at RNA splicing. That is that includes students from MIT, from UT, from Caltech, from Penn, and that includes students and faculty from both biology, machine learning, and formal methods. And so being able to come together and learn this common language and starting to build up the infrastructure that is necessary to push this research, assembling data sets and test beds, and really starting to try out different techniques on this problem has been extremely powerful, and something that could not have happened without this project. And we're starting to see similar efforts around cognitive science, and we're bringing up to speed all the different domains that are part of this project to be able to really make these concentrated pushes around these different areas, and at the same time make sure that on the one hand the advances on the method side are informed by real hard problems in all of these different domains, and making sure that we are actually making progress with respect to these areas. We're also collaborating on a survey of neurosymbolic program synthesis that we expect to be an essential reading for all the students joining this project, and potentially the rest of the community who will be working in these problems. In terms of outreach, we have also started our monthly webinar series. We had our first talk in September, and we expect to continue with that. So you can find more information about this in our webpage. We also have started doing some of the outreach that was promised in the proposal. For example, we had a virtual booth at the ACM Tapia conference aimed at celebrating diversity in computing. And through our booth, we were actually able to collect CVs from 38 different students from underrepresented backgrounds. And we are looking to select a small number of students from that pool to and provide with summer research opportunities as part of this project. And here you can actually see how our virtual booth looks like. It's not quite the same as being there in real life, but as you can see from those numbers, it served its purpose. And so I want to wrap up to leave some time for questions and discussions, but I hope you enjoy the rest of the event. So if you have questions, probably the easiest thing is to write them on the chat.
I have a question.
Sure.
I'm wondering, are there any plans to initiate startups based on these ideas in program synthesis and neurosymbolic learning?
Well, one of our goals is to have real world impact, right? And we are really interested in pushing these technologies to the point where they can be making the world a better place, right? And whether that is through startups or whether that is through industrial collaborations, or whether it is by really just demonstrating the technology to the point where people across industry can pick it up and run with it. That that will be determined as the project goes along, and based on the initiative of everybody in the group. But I would say that it is our goal as part of this project to really push the technology to practice, really demonstrate that we can move the needle on all of these problems that we have set up. Our dream outcome for this project is that by the time the project is over, we have demonstrated that a new class of techniques, and we have demonstrated their applicability in all of these problems to the point where when somebody is trying to solve problems in this domain, they reach first to this kind of approaches. So I see another question here. Can you formally define what neurosymbolic research is? So that is a very good question, and we've had a lot of discussions around this topic, exactly where we draw the boundary of the work that we are trying to do. So for us, the thing that is key and the key novelty in this effort is the interaction between deep learning and between gradient optimization-based learning techniques, and the combination of that with symbolic reasoning. So techniques that involve both the learning and the construction of neural networks or of other learning structures based on optimization, together with symbolic elements, whether they are in the form of programs or whether they are in the form of logical constraints, and where these programs or these logical constraints are themselves being learned, they're being constructed as part of this process. To us, that is the essence of the kind of techniques that we are targeting with this project. Yes, that was me trying to come up with last minute logo.
So I'm wondering, how many startups are there as part of this Expeditions project so far?
Well, we started 4 months ago, so none.
And how many startups do you have scheduled to join within the next year?
None.
Okay, that's good to know.
Are there any other questions?
I have a question.
Yes.
Do you expect any overlap between the different thrusts or strands?
Yes, that is a very good question. One of the things that is really critical for a project like this is that it doesn't devolve into 5 separate and independent efforts, each tackling a different
Oh, sorry, go ahead.
Yes, so it's really critical that this doesn't devolve into independent efforts, each tackling a separate domain, but rather that there are synergies between the different efforts. And so we are already looking at many of these synergies where, for example, the kind of techniques that were initially thought of as useful for analyzing computer systems. We are now looking at whether we can leverage them, for example, for understanding RNA splicing, or whether the infrastructure that is built up to do neurosymbolic synthesis in the context of cognitive science problems can actually be leveraged to understand computer systems. And we believe that it's really that cross-pollination between these different domains that is going to push us when developing the core technologies, the core reasoning technologies, to make sure that these technologies are general, that they're not just custom ad hoc solutions to individual problem domains, but rather that you really build up from these a science of neurosymbolic reasoning that allows you to bridge all of these different domains. So we have another question here. So this question relates to this question relates to one of the strengths of program synthesis techniques is the ability to produce multiple explanations for the observations, and the ability to actually reason about the relationships between these different observations. And so I think one of the questions here is whether or not you might lose that when you go to a combined model that includes neural components, whether you might lose the ability to do that. And you certainly could. And this is one of the things that is really crucial, to identify ways of doing that where you do not. In particular, for example, extraction techniques, like the one that I mentioned in passing, in relation to this drone work, where at the end of the process, you still find a single discrete program that satisfies your goal. So by using that kind of technique, you could actually potentially generate multiple different programs, introduce constraints to make sure that the different programs that you're generating are not just different ways of writing the same program. And then based on that, leverage all the toolkit that we have from program analysis in order to actually find a program that you want. I think also bringing in probabilistic reasoning, where you can actually capture not just a single program, but a whole distribution over programs, where you can actually not just tell that there are these different solutions, but you can actually assign probabilities to them, can potentially allow you to reason even more effectively about these multiplicities of models. So let's see, there's so one question here from Osbert. So there is so what is the equivalent of ImageNet for these neurosymbolic methods? So one of the things that I see as a potentially very powerful outcome of this project is if we can develop the equivalent of ImageNet for many of these domains, in order to make it easier for people with expertise in machine learning, or with expertise at the intersection of machine learning and formal methods, where they can, in a low effort manner, they can try out their different algorithms, evaluate them, and measure them against state-of-the-art techniques, and in this way allow us to very quickly make progress in many of these domains. Every single one of the domains that we selected was selected partly based on the fact that there was a sense that there was a gradient of problems, from problems that are immediately tractable with the techniques we have today to problems that will really require fundamental advances in our capabilities, right? And the fact that there's enough to each one of these problems to move a research agenda forward for several years is critical, so that we're not just going to solve those problems in the first year and then move on. So in the schedule at this point, we have a short break while we set up.
I think Chris had a question that you missed in the chat.
Let's see.
Yeah.
So yes, so there is a question here on what do I see as the key research questions that need to be answered on the core technical side. So one of the really big challenges is just the fact that there is this big mismatch between the style of reasoning that comes from what we like to call the synthesis 2.0 era of formal methods-based program synthesis techniques, where there's a strong emphasis on logic reasoning, there's strong emphasis on discrete combinatorial search, and the kind of optimization-based techniques that you have in deep learning. And so as we've worked more on this problem, we've gained much more of an understanding and much more of a respect of the challenges in bridging that gap, right? And it turns out there's a whole space of possibilities in terms of how to bring in the insights from the formal method side to help train neural networks better, as well as the ways in which we can take the insights from and the techniques from deep learning and bring them to bear in order to search for programs more efficiently. I think Swarat is going to talk in a lot more detail in the next talk on some of these technical challenges and some of these techniques that are being explored as part of this project. So I'm going to take one last question. So there is a question of, is the machine learning side constrained only to neural networks, or do we envision that the primary alignment will be neural networks, but they might be augmented by other systems? We definitely don't want to constrain ourselves purely by neural networks. And in fact, we think there is very strong value in, for example, different techniques for Bayesian inference, or even things like genetic algorithms, as you point out. So what we're interested in here is to really build that synergy between the symbolic and our ability to reason symbolically at scale with machine learning broadly construed. And so we're going to move to the break now. So what we're going to do is we have 10 minutes before the next talk starts. So while that happens, what we're going to do is we're going to create a handful of small breakout rooms so that you can talk to other participants in a smaller setting than a 30-way discussion. And so I will do that, and then I will see you back in 10 minutes.
not yet, but we're hoping soon.
Yeah, we are very interested in the biology problem in particular, applying these ideas there, because it seems like learning rules should be of interest there. But what do you think?
Well, I'm still a complete novice when it comes to the.
Streaming.
By the way, Armando, I don't know if you're following the live stream, but Raz was like asking questions on the chat window, asking like, how do I ask questions?
Oh.
The live stream, but Raz was like asking questions on the chat window, asking like, how do I ask questions?
Sorry for the echo. Now, let's see if we can make this work a little bit better.
Okay, but you're just seeing my main slide, right?
Yes.
Okay.
But...
Oh, I'm seeing the whole presenter mode.
Okay, that's weird. So
I think if you hit the swap displays.
Okay, but you're just seeing my main slide, right?
Yes.
That looks right to me. Surat.
Okay, wonderful.
Okay, so I think we should start.
Should I start?
Yes.
Wait, I can't hear you all of a sudden. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Okay.
So,
fantastic.
yes, we should start.
Great. All right, welcome back, everybody. In the last talk, Armando gave an overview of the kinds of problems that we are going to solve in this project. But in this talk, what I'm going to do is to just drill down on the core computer science technical part of things. And I'm going to talk specifically about the problem of neurosymbolic program synthesis and the different forms that neurosymbolic models can take. let's just start with the big picture view. Here we have the traditional view of deep learning. And here what you're given is a data set. And you have this learner which goes and generates this neural net, or specifically the weights of the neural net. Now, if you think of what's going on here, you can think of this as a sort of program synthesis. A neural network is a function, and therefore it is a program. But it just happens to be a really low-level program. Now, what we are hoping to do over here is to introduce some high-level abstractions into this picture. So specifically, our programs, rather than just being a monolithic low-level neural net, we are going to have a mix of symbolic code and neural modules. And as an additional input on top of the data, we could also imagine having some syntactic and semantic constraints. And when we are trying to solve the optimization problem of learning a program, we can actually do this optimization modulo the constraint. That's the objective over here. Now, in the rest of this talk, I'm going to talk about three things. I'll talk about the different kinds of representations that we can have, specifically that picture that we showed where there was this mix of neural nets and symbolic code. What are the kinds of compositions that are possible over there? Then I'm going to talk about a couple of learning algorithms, and I'll end with just a single slide on some of the challenges that remain open on just the core computer science front. Okay, so one form that these neurosymbolic programs can take is something like this. Here, what you have is an input X, and first it's being fed through a set of neural modules, and then these neural modules are outputting something, and then there is a symbolic piece of code that's taking these outputs and then producing some sort of a final output. So if I wanted to write this down in an algebraic form, I would write something like sigma of nu1 of x through nu k of x, where the nus represent neural nets and the sigma represents something symbolic. We recently looked into this kind of composition in the context of transfer learning. And here, let's imagine that you have the following simple task. Let's say that you already know how to classify MNIST digits. But now let's suppose that you want to do this more complex task where you have a mix of perception and algorithmic reasoning. So specifically, let's say that given a picture like what you see on the right-hand side, you want to automatically generate the sum of all of those digits that appear in that list. And so for simplicity, we are going to assume that that picture is just given to us as a list of digits. So basically, there is a grid, and it's been used to chop that picture on the right up. So you're really given a list of MNIST digits, and now you're being asked to compute the sum. So if you ask a typical programmer who's familiar with functional languages, which is what we used over here, to do such a task, they're going to probably write a piece of code like what you see now. You're going to take the input list, you're going to apply a map to it in which each of these individual pictures are classified. And then finally, you're going to have a fold that just adds up the results of all of these individual function applications. And that's being done using this lambda, which is this add function represented also as a neural network. And so the way this particular instantiation that we looked at that worked is that it assumed that there is this library of neural modules. And here in particular, you have this classify digit operation in that library. And the system went ahead and generated this neurosymbolic program over here. And so what we were able to show is that this sort of an approach does help with transfer, because you're really exploiting the modularity of the underlying programming language to use knowledge that was learned in a previous setting in a completely new context where a lot of other skills are called for as well. And so here what you see is a graph where on the x-axis you have training data set for the new task, which is the summing of digits. And on the y-axis you have error. So what you would want to see if, in case there has been a lot of transfer, is that the error drops very quickly, and that's what ends up happening over here when you're using this neurosymbolic approach as opposed to a purely neural approach, which is captured by some of the other lines up there. Okay, another kind of composition that I'll talk about is this. Here you have a symbolic module and a neural module that are being algebraically composed. One way to think about it is that you are still doing deep learning. However, you're using the symbolic program as a regularizer. And it's, of course, extremely common to use regularization in machine learning. But now what we are saying is that this regularizer is actually going to be a program that captures some human insights about a problem domain. And so we used this idea recently in a couple of papers. This was in the reinforcement learning setting where you're trying to learn a policy for an agent that is interacting with the environment. Now, in deep reinforcement learning, which is the dominant approach in this area at this point, you have a neural representation of policies. Now, what we used instead was this hybrid representation where you have an algebraic composition of a neural net and a classical controller. And so one way to think about it is that this classical controller is introducing some bias into the learning process, but it's good bias because there is, again, human knowledge involved in the construction of this controller. And at the same time, you're going beyond traditional control by just allowing this extra bit of data-driven flexibility that is coming out of the neural net. So it's basically figuring out how to do some really, crazy stuff based on the patterns in the data. However, it is also not going too far away from the classical symbolic controller. And what this means is that if you were going with something purely neural, you would have more variance. This is a way of reducing variance in learning. And so here you see evidence of that. What you see is, this is from a card domain. What you see is that on the left-hand side, you have a regularized car with this sort of symbolic regularization. On the right-hand side, you have a purely neural car. And what you see is that the training, it's much more stable. The car is on the left is behaving much more safely earlier on in the training. But yet, by the time training ends, your performance isn't really all that different. So you're not taking a huge performance hit, it turns out. Okay, so I'm just going to show you a few other forms. Over here, what you see is an if-then-else composition. This is something that we recently explored in a NeurIPS paper, an upcoming paper. Here, the motivation was safety. Basically, the symbolic module over here, the symbolic sigma, was a safe but lower performance policy that was shielding the neural policy nu from taking unsafe actions. And over here you have another kind of composition that came out in some of Armando's older work. Here you have this big machine learning model which is broken down into a lot of these symbolic pieces, but then you have a neural module that is orchestrating, ensembling, if you will, all of these symbolic pieces. And finally, this is the last picture is something that comes up in some of Yisong's recent work. And here, what you have is that a symbolic program is being used to generate data for a neural learning process. And as a result, they show that you can learn using a lot less human supervision. So I'm now going to jump to the algorithmic issues here. We have talked about the different forms that models can take, but what are the optimization challenges that arise over here? Well, the issue is that now you're talking with extremely complex optimization objectives because the space of programs is combinatorial and discrete. The space of programs doesn't necessarily have gradients. And at the same time, you are working with a space where there is an inherent quantitative dimension. It's really optimization at the end. So these classic logic-based approaches that were used all over in Synthesis 2.0, that is no longer viable at this point, at least by themselves. You have to complement them. So that's what we are going to try to demonstrate, that there are some natural ways of bringing together logical and quantitative methods in solving these sorts of difficult optimization problems in the space of programs. So let's start by with something that you might think of doing as an initial approach in this kind of a problem space. Again, remember that the problem is the following. You're given a space of programs. So you're given a set of syntactic constraints. That's this phi syn over here on programs, and maybe some semantic constraints as well. And what you're trying to do is to find a program that fits these semantic and syntactic constraints and that also optimizes some sort of an objective. Okay, that's our goal. So then one thing that you could imagine is that you could just use these symbolic methods that we developed in Synthesis 2.0 to generate architectures of these models. So essentially the entirety of the programs, all of the discrete pieces, except for the parameters of any neural modules that you might be using. And then just training these architectures. Now, you can take this approach some distance. In fact, that's what we did in this paper from 2018. But it seems like we could do better through a more tight coupling of these statistical methods from machine learning and symbolic methods. And so here are just 3 ideas that have come up in the recent past in this literature in work by PIs in this project. And so the first idea is that of meta-learning. Now, meta-learning is a popular technique even in general machine learning, but in the setting of program learning, this is especially powerful because meta-learning turns out to be a great way of learning methods for reusable policies for searching over large program spaces. And so this is a paper that Armando and Josh Tannenbaum have appearing in the upcoming NeurIPS. And so here, what you're trying to do is to essentially learn to produce action sequences like run, run, this capital run, given just natural language text. And natural language is compositional. And so one hopes to somehow figure out that compositionality and then use that in order to generate the action sequence corresponding to that natural language text. So the classical approach to this, classical being what appeared in their prior work, was entirely neural. But one of the problems over there is that because neural nets are error prone, sometimes, especially on long sequences, they tend to produce outputs that are just kind of garbage. They're just wrong in essential logical ways. And so in this work, what they did is adopt this hybrid approach where they are starting with a set of support examples. So this is all the examples that the model has seen in the past. So for example, it knows that run twice corresponds to run, run, look thrice corresponds to look, look, look. And now this neural model, rather than trying to do something for the final task, it is just coming up with some grammars, which are the things that are going to be used in the final task. And so these grammars are really, you can think of them as declarative programs. And so a bunch of these grammars are produced by the neural model. This really represents a distribution over these grammars. Now, the good thing about having this sort of an explicit symbolic program is that now you can check using rigorous programming language semantics whether or not these grammars are actually consistent with the examples that you have seen so far. So over here, what we see is that these 2 grammars on the top, they immediately violate some of the previous examples. And so it's the third one over here that makes the most sense. And this is what is then used on the query set that is new examples. And what they show is that this is a really fantastic way of just learning from a not very large set of examples and then solving these sorts of queries on just 1 or 2 examples. Another approach that has come up in recent work by Isong and myself, this is also going to be published at NeurIPS 2020, is the use of neural networks as relaxations of large discrete sets of programs. And so here is the essential idea. Think about that picture of top-down search that I showed a couple of slides ago. You are exploring this combinatorial space of programs, and more specifically what you're doing is that you are starting at a root node where you have really no code, you know nothing about the program, and you're progressively adding more and more and more code until you arrive at some sort of a complete program. that is parameterized. You might still have to train it, but it's otherwise complete. Now, one of the challenges in this sort of top-down search is that when you are at intermediate points in the search, you don't really know how to assign value to this intermediate node. There are many possible ways in which that incomplete program could be completed. So here, if you look at this shaded node, there is this G star over there, this G star, which is an unknown program, and that can be completed in many possible ways, right? And it's a massive discrete set. So how do I assign value to that intermediate node? How do I know if it's good or bad? So what we propose to do is that you take that partial program and you replace that whole with a neural network whose weights really serve as approximations of the entire space of discrete completions that are possible for that incomplete program, okay? And then you learn, you optimize that neural network in context, and then what you do is that you use this resulting loss as a heuristic. So essentially, if by replacing that whole with a neural network, you were able to get a really good loss, that means that there exists some way of completing this program, right, with a full-on function that's going to lead to low loss, and therefore that's good for us. Now, there is, of course, an approximation here, but it turns out that if you use this as a search heuristic, and if you plug this into one of these classic algorithms for admissible search, then, or for heuristic search, then it turns out that you get some guarantees. You actually get a guarantee that your neural network, because of the ability of neural networks to really approximate any function, this leads to an admissible heuristic, which leads to, again, an approximately optimal solution. And so what we found over here is that we were able to get pretty complex programs. So this is a program from a behavior classification problem where you're trying to classify the behavior of basketball trajectories. And we found these sorts of optimal programs much quicker than alternative approaches. So one last approach that I'll talk about is that of neural residuals. Now, if you go back to the program synthesis literature, the older program synthesis literature, there is a family of approaches where you're going top-down. There's also a family of approaches where you are starting with an initial program, and then you're progressively improving it by essentially tweaking that program a little bit. And if you think of database query optimization, a lot of that kind of work uses this sort of a strategy. So we figured out a way of using neural networks in doing this. And so essentially what you do is that you start with an initial symbolic program sigma 1. Now you think about a perturbation applied to this sigma 1 in the form of a neural net. Okay, so this is going to be your nu2 plus sigma 1. This is an algebraic combination of a neural and a symbolic function. Okay, and now the good thing is that once you have this neural component, you can improve it using gradient descent in a data-driven way. So from nu2, you can go to nu3, and you are improving the neural piece of things. So the performance of your overall program is getting better and better. The neural component is basically pushing you towards your a more optimal program. And now what you do is that you project this back to the neural space, to the symbolic space. You take this red arrow, and then you go to the symbolic program sigma 2. Then again, you apply some neural pieces, you add a neural component, you apply some gradient updates, and then you again do a projection, and so on and so forth. So progressively, your symbolic programs are getting better by leveraging some of the gains obtained by the neural pieces through gradient descent. And this, it turns out, can be thought of as a sort of gradient mirror descent, which is a classic approach to constraint optimization. And so essentially you can think of, you're doing gradient-based optimization in a space where there is a constraint, namely the constraint of being expressible in the symbolic language, and periodically you are projecting back to the symbolic space, and then you are doing some more updates and then projecting back, and so on and so forth. Okay? So I'm going to, in the interest of time, not go through this in too much detail. I'll just say that just ask you to focus on this graph on the left, which shows that as the iterations are going on, on the x-axis, on the y-axis, you have a performance measure. Your performance is actually improving steadily, and this is something that we found in a range of benchmarks, and also in a more recent paper that Ishil and I were involved in. Okay, so let me just end with some of the technical challenges, going back to the questions that Chris raised at the end of the last talk. So I would say that what we have seen over here is that neurosymbolic models, which combine symbolic programs with neural networks, this is a really rich space of functions. You can orchestrate neural and symbolic pieces in many different ways. I have already given you 5 examples, and many more are presumably possible. Armando mentioned a survey that some of us are writing on this topic. We are going to cover in detail many of these possible kinds of compositions. One of the big questions here, though, is how are these symbolic pieces going to be specified? Presumably, they'll come out of some sort of a DSL, and this DSL captures prior knowledge about a task, and that is something that we'll have to carefully design. There is a lot of research that needs to be done on how such specifications are to be done. And then there is the question of algorithms and benchmarks. So we need to have new benchmarks with new data sets and new kinds of symbolic specifications. And these we are hoping will come out of these interactions with the many domain experts that are part of our project. And then there's the question of coming up with new algorithms. I have shown you a couple of examples, but there's a lot more that can be done over here. Again, this is a whole new playground of research waiting to be explored. And finally, I would say that we really need to think in terms of big compute over here. Classical work on program synthesis tended to focus on these applications where answers had to come out within a few seconds. We are not really constrained by this, I would say. We are more in the machine learning world where we are allowed to use big compute and take a lot of time to come up with trained models, so long as those models give us amazing results. And this will require a new way of thinking, new investment into systems, and also discussions with folks who are on the hardware side of things. And with that, I will end my talk. I believe we are going to take questions at the end in the form of a panel, but I can take just one question while Osbert is setting up.
So I think probably it's best to just switch to Osbert right away.
Okay, sure, makes sense.
So Osbert, are you ready?
Yeah. Oh, I can just share here. Okay, can everyone hear me and see my screen?
Yes, perfect.
Okay. Hi, everyone. So today I'm going to be, I guess, talking about some work that's building on the same direction that Swarat's already given you some background about, but I think from a somewhat different perspective. So what I'm really interested in is using programs to capture high-level structure in data. And as a human, when you look around at data in the world, all this kind of structure is very apparent. So just as some examples, if you look at an image of a building facade, you immediately see that there are these kinds of high-level 2D repeating patterns in the data. Another example is in video. If you look at video of car trajectories, they fall into these really nice clusters which correspond to lanes. And then the lanes themselves have structure, things like adjacent parallel lanes, intersections, places where you can turn, change lanes, and so forth. There's also structure in text data. If you look at web data, websites, there's the tree structure that is present there. Even a little bit more outside of the range of the previous examples is control. If you look at here, I'm at the bottom left, I'm showing a parallel parking task where a car has to, actually in this case, exit a parallel parking spot. And in this case, there's this structure in terms of the trajectory that the car has to take, where it has to do this kind of back and forth repeating motion. And finally, just as a natural language example, if you look at a lot of language obviously has a lot of hierarchical structure. One place where there's a particularly very rich structure is poetry. So if you look at poetry, there's a lot of structure, things like rhyming lines or meter and so on in the poem. And just to make things a little more precise, when I talk about structure, I'm mostly talking about constraints on the relationships between different portions of the data. And inferring structure is really an unsupervised learning problem. So trying to just, given a bunch of examples of data, infer what is the structure in that data. And so because it's an unsupervised learning problem, we might expect that deep neural networks are really good at this task, because in fact, one of the major reasons deep neural networks have been so successful is precisely because they can discover, automatically learn structure given the data available. The problem is that deep neural networks are actually really good mainly at capturing low-level structure. Just to give an example, coming back to this image of building facades, so here I'm showing what's called an image completion task. So given the partial image in the middle, we're asking the deep neural network to complete it into a full image. And if you ask the deep neural network to do this, on the right-hand side, I'm showing the results of a state-of-the-art deep generative model. And as you can see, it does a really bad job. As a human looking at this example, you kind of immediately notice that there is this 2D repeating pattern of windows. You'd be able to extrapolate based on just a few examples of building facades that probably in this case that, this one column of windows you see is still going to repeat across the image. And therefore, you'd be able to use this information to help you do complete the image. But right now, especially in the low data regime, deep neural networks are basically unable to leverage this structure. Our goal is to try to represent structure, design algorithms that can represent structure as programs. So in this case, the high-level representation of structure would just be a nested for loop that describes that there is this repeating pattern of windows in the image. And you can formalize this as a probabilistic model where we're given these examples of images, but we're not given we're not explicitly told what is the structure of this image. And what we really want to be able to do is go from the image to and discover the latent structure that's present in the data. And this is really a program synthesis problem. We're given some kind of input, and we want to infer from that input a program that represents the structure of that input. So yeah, we want to take this image and output a program that represents the structure in the image. So we've kind of designed an algorithm for solving this, a domain-specific program synthesis algorithm for solving this. And basically what we want to do is solve the following optimization problem. We want to find the program over some domain-specific language of programs. We want to find the one that best matches the data. And in this case, this match function basically counts the number of constraints in the program that are actually present in the image. And we want to maximize the quantity of matches. So just to make things very concrete, in this case, the program might say that we want all 16 of these squares to be exactly identical, and allowing for some threshold of similarity. And maybe in this case, 14 out of the 16 match. So we'd assign it a score of 14 out of 16, which in this case might be a pretty good score. And this nested for loop would actually represent useful structure in the image. And then we actually want to represent multiple, not just one repeating pattern, but in many cases we want multiple. So we have a greedy strategy that kind of greedily chooses the most promising match at each step. And as a result, we get this, using our synthesis algorithm, we now have this rich data set of image structure pairs that we can use in downstream tasks. So in this project, we were specifically looking at generative modeling. So we can actually use kind of a standard incorporate these programs into a standard generative modeling framework. I'm not going to go into the details of exactly what the math is, but at a very high level, basically, we use variational inference and show that we can incorporate programs into the, as a part of the variational assumption and come up with a variational lower bound on the log likelihood. But what all that means is just that we basically decompose the generation problem into two phases. In the first phase, we're going to generate some representation of some realistic programmatic structure. For example, maybe this 2D for loop I've shown on the left-hand side. We use a VAE, but you can use any generative model you want. And then conditioned on this structure, we're going to basically, in the second phase, conditioned on this structure, we're going to generate an example that satisfies the constraints in the program. And again, you can use any conditional generative model in this phase. So we can also apply this technique to image completion. So in this task, which I described at the beginning, we're actually given a partial image and we want to complete it into the full image. In this case, we take we first use our program synthesis algorithm to infer the structure in the partial image. And this time we actually, rather than generating program from scratch, we actually take this partial representation of partial structure, and we train a neural network to extrapolate this structure to what we basically imagine should be the structure in the full image. So the difference is a little subtle, but it's basically this change in the second loop iteration variable bound, where we want to basically say that this structure is just going to repeat over the x-axis of the image. And then the remainder proceeds as before. We basically generate a completion of our image based on the content that satisfies the constraints of this program. And I do want to emphasize here that our results are still not perfect, but as you can see, it's significantly closer to the original image than the original state-of-the-art deep neural network that I showed earlier in the talk. And one of the really important directions for future work is developing better synthesis algorithms that can better capture the structure that's present in images. So here are just a few more examples, and they kind of show the same patterns. On the top line, I'm showing the original image. In the middle line, I'm showing the completion using our technique. And in the bottom line, bottom row, I'm showing the completion using a state-of-the-art deep neural network. And in all of these cases, you can see that our approach substantially outperforms the previous state-of-the-art using deep learning. And this is also reflected in our quantitative evaluation. But I'm not going to go into any detail on that. And so we've been trying to move to domains beyond visual data. In particular, we're looking at richer sets. So the constraints I talked about so far are mostly equality constraints, saying that different sub-images are equal or close to being equal. So we're also looking at relational constraints between different parts of the data. So in this domain, for this task, we've been looking at the poetry domain because, like I said, there is very interesting and rich structure in poetry, things like rhyming and meter. And we have a representation of the structure as this bipartite graph. So it's a graph with two kinds of nodes. First, we have nodes representing different parts of the data. So in particular, in this case, there's a node for each line in the poem. And then there are also what we call prototype nodes. And these are kind of basically the kind of prototypical examples from which we're going to derive the lines in the poem. And finally, each line is labeled with its relationship to its prototype. So basically, whether it rhymes with its prototype and whether it has the same meter as its prototype. And in particular, what this representation ensures is that any pair of nodes that shares the same prototype are going to rhyme. And this is a very compact representation of the structure in the poem. And then we can just do exactly the same approach that I talked about it before. We came up with a program synthesis algorithm to basically synthesize the relational structure present in a poem. And basically, I'm not going to go into details, but basically we want to choose the one that has the most relationships. And we're going to solve for this so this time the greedy strategy doesn't really apply. So we actually used a combinatorial optimization solver called Z3, which is this general purpose tool that's been widely used in program synthesis. And we used it to synthesize basically the best representation of the underlying structure. And then we fed it into this two-phase generative approach as before, where we first generate a representation, some plausible programmatic structure, and then we generate a poem that satisfies those constraints. In this case, we just use a specialized constraint sampling algorithm to do so. And as you can see, we compared our approach to GPT-2. And as you can see, GPT-2, the text is very good. So in this case, it does generate realistic low-level text, but it completely fails to kind of capture the structure in poetry. It's not really able to generate things like rhymes or lines with the same meter and so on. And we know there is this big, powerful new model called GPT-3 that's now available, which generates even better, even more coherent text. But at least based on what we've seen, people kind of using GPT-3 to generate poetry, it suffers from the same issues. It's not really able to capture the high-level structure in the data, even though it really does a good job with the low-level structure. So I think using these kinds of programmatic representations is really complementary to the deep neural network approaches in this case. Another really nice benefit of our approach is that we actually, by having this intermediate representation of the structure in the text that we're trying to generate, we actually have basically a knob that the user can leverage in order to guide the generative model. And basically, just to give a very simple example, on the left-hand side is a poem generated using our algorithm, where there's 2 rhyming pairs of lines. The last four lines are basically 2 rhyming pairs. And the user, we just went and modified the structure to say that, okay, we actually want all 4 of these last lines to rhyme. And then we can just throw this new program at the same the second phase generative model, and we generate a new poem that satisfies the constraints. And this, I think of this as kind of enabling a kind of programmability in the generative modeling pipeline. So just to kind of another domain where a related domain where we looked at this was the problem of generating referring expressions. In this domain, and in this application, what we want is we want to take an image and a distinguished object in this image. For example, the gray cube labeled G in the image I've shown on the left-hand side. And we want to generate a natural language utterance that uniquely, to a listener, will uniquely identify that object. And this is actually a particularly challenging instance of this problem because the objects G and H are identical. So in this case, you actually have to use the relationships between the objects in order to distinguish distinguish G from H. And that means that you have to talk about, say that G is in front of the brown sphere, whereas H is behind the brown sphere. And that's kind of the difference, the brown sphere being F. So in these cases where you need these complex relationships, it turns out that trying to directly go from the image to the natural language, which is what most existing techniques do, is very challenging. So instead, we go through an intermediate representation where we first generate the structure, the programmatic structure that we want to be present in the natural language. In this case, the relationships that are expressed in the natural language. So we first generate this structure, and then we generate the natural language conditioned on the structure. So just looking a little, so far I've been talking mostly about generation. Looking a little more broadly, we're also interested in all sorts of other tasks. So we've been using, we have some work in progress trying to leverage programmatic structure in downstream prediction tasks. So in one project, we're looking at trying to leverage programmatic, basically the structure in video trajectory data in order to write structured queries over this data. And basically we have a combination of this high level language, which is this kind of regular expression that you can use to express trajectories in the data. For example, to match right turn, you might say that you're in one lane, the car's in one lane, and then it does something and then it ends up in another lane that's perpendicular to the first lane. And you can write expressions like this, but then the kind of the predicates in lane 1, in lane 2, these are matched using a deep neural network. And we're also looking kind of along the same lines in information extraction in the semi-structured setting, where you want to leverage a combination of deep neural networks to handle natural language, but also have programmatic components to handle the high-level structure. For example, the tree structure of the web page. One thing that, since we're talking about these neural symbolic programs, I think a really critical and more foundational piece that we're working on is getting really good uncertainty estimates for neural components. And in particular, as we're starting to mix neural networks with logical components found in existing programs, we're really going to have to be able to reason about and quantify the properties of the neural networks. And I think in particular, getting estimates of the uncertainties of these models, I think will be a really critical tool for enabling us to build good neurosymbolic programs. And in this, and so we have some work in this direction, trying to rigorously quantify uncertainty in deep neural network predictions. And so we have one paper on trying to get packed confidence sets. So these are confidence sets over neural network predictions that come with provable guarantees based on statistical learning theory. And so here are some examples for ImageNet. And really, I think these will enable us to do some of the stuff that Swara touched on, where you want to compose, if the neural net is confident, then you do take one action, otherwise you fall back on other actions, say like some logical component or some that maybe is you're more confident in its prediction. We also have some work in this direction in the setting of domain adaptation. And yeah, finally, just looking even more broadly, we also have a lot of work on leveraging programmatic structure and reinforcement learning. Again, similar to some of the stuff that Armando and Swara touched on, thinking about things like safety, generalizability, interpretability. One really exciting project we have is trying to show that we can actually use synthesized rules to improve human behavior at a kind of a virtual kitchen game, and programmability and combinatorial constraints. And just to summarize, so I think there's a lot of benefits from incorporating programs into machine learning, and I've touched on just a few of them, things like better generalizability, especially in the setting of few examples, improving interpretability, enabling programmability, and I think there are many more that we're going to discover along the way. So thanks for listening, and I'll be happy to take any questions in the Q&A session at the end.
All right, thank you. Thanks a lot. So our last presentation for this set is going to be Chris Birch, and he's going to tell us about RNA splicing. So can you share your screen?
Yeah.
Perfect.
All right, can everyone see and hear?
Yes.
Yes? Okay, great. All right, so Armando asked me to talk about challenges in RNA splicing. So I'm a biologist in the biology department here, and really a computational biologist by training, and also director of the MIT's Computational and Systems Biology program. So I was very happy to get involved in this project. So I want to just briefly sort of review some of the sort of biochemistry of splicing, which is sort of at the foundation of this, since there is a biochemical process that we're attempting to model computationally here, and then kind of draw out some of the computational challenges. And so this model shown here is actually, this clay model is actually a picture of splicing with the RNA transcript shown in yellow, the RNA polymerase shown in blue, and it emphasizes that splicing is actually occurring co-transcriptionally in the process of transcription, which is an interesting aspect of the problem. All right, so we've learned from deep sequencing in the past few years that almost all human genes undergo alternative splicing, so that there's just lots and lots of splicing. So almost all genes must undergo splicing in order to produce the correct mRNA. And then there's this opportunity for variation in that splicing process, which can occur in different cell types or tissues or different conditions here. So splicing just briefly occurs in the nucleus, and then involves removal of introns and ligation of exons, as Armando introduced before, producing a mature mRNA that is then exported to the cytoplasm where it directs translation. And you can, the process of alternative splicing is where you use different combinations of these exons. So for example, to produce these two different mRNAs, the longer one on the left with a pink exon and the shorter one that lacks this exon. And these mRNAs will typically encode different proteins, although sometimes they may differ in other aspects as well. So just to briefly introduce the chemistry, splicing involves two chemical steps. In the first step, a segment near the 3' or downstream end of the intron forms this unusual branch structure where it forms a covalent attachment to the 5' end of the intron here. Here the boxes represent exons, the lines represent introns, so you get this branched RNA. And then in the second step of splicing, the 2 exons are joined together and the intron is released in this so-called lariat form. The intron is typically rapidly degraded and then the exons go on to become the mature mRNA. So quite a bit is known about the biochemistry of splicing. I just want to kind of briefly introduce some of the players here. So splicing is catalyzed by a very large protein RNA complex consisting of several small RNAs and literally hundreds of proteins called the spliceosome. It is not a pre-built complex, but actually assembles dynamically on the primary RNA transcript. So there are these components called SNRPs, U1, U2, U4, U5, U6, which are the key RNA protein complexes. So the U1 SNRP recognizes what's called the 5' splice site at the 5' end of the intron. And then there are components, U2AF and others that recognize signals at the 3' or downstream end of the intron. And these components replace one another. So this BBP and U2AF that are there early are then replaced by U2 prior to the first step in splicing in different well-defined complexes. Again, the details are not critical here, but I want to give a sort of an overall picture of the chemistry that's happening. And then this component U1 at the 5' splice site is also replaced by another component U6 prior to formation of this catalytically active complex here. Here you have the cleavage of this junction and the ligation onto the so-called branch site adenosine there. And then in the second step, the 2 exons are removed and the spliceosome remains attached to the lariat, and then the lariat is degraded and the spliceosome components are then recycled. And recently, with advances in cryo-EM, we actually have structures of a number of these components, the SNRPs and even whole spliceosomes, which is one type of data that that could be brought to bear in this project. Okay, so where is the information for splicing? So some of it is clearly in these sequence motifs that occur at the boundaries of exons and introns. So here, these data are for human. Here's a picture of the 5' splice site motif, which occurs here, is recognized by U1. The 3' splice site motif is kind of a bipartite motif with a pyrimidine tract here, composed of Ys or pyrimidine nucleotides that are C or T. And then this short YAG motif here. And then there's this branch point motif, but as you can see, it's quite degenerate. It doesn't contain a lot of information. But these motifs, at least in human splicing, are clearly not sufficient to specify the boundaries of introns. If you make models of these, try to simulate splicing with these alone, it doesn't work well at all. So clearly there's additional information present in the transcript that's used by the splicing machinery, and that's really a big challenge of this project. And so molecular biologists have described different types of elements that exist in primary transcripts that contribute to splicing. Generally, we call them splicing regulatory elements, sometimes SREs, and have generally categorized them into 4 different types. So they can exist in the introns and be intronic splicing enhancers or silencers, or can exist in the exons and be exonic splicing enhancers or silencers, where the enhancers promote inclusion of the exon and the silencers generally block inclusion of the exon or block splicing. And so these elements contribute to alternative splicing and are involved in decisions about production of different isoforms in different tissues, but they also play a role just in the basic splicing of a constitutive splicing as well. So these elements, these splicing enhancers and silencers, are recognized by, in general, by proteins. So just as the core splice sites are recognized by the SNRPs, these enhancer and silencers are recognized by proteins in the HNRNP family, the SR protein family, which are ubiquitously expressed in all cell types, as well as by tissue-specific factors, including those from the RB-FOX family, the self and muscleblind family, and literally dozens of others. And exactly how they assemble onto the transcript and influence one another's interactions and spliceosome assembly is not well understood. Okay, but we do know of particular interactions that are definitely important in splicing. So in particular, these SR proteins recognize these exonic splicing enhancers and then interact with components of the core splicing machinery, such as U1 SNRP and U2AF, as shown here, to promote recognition of that segment as an exon. So human genes have a very expanded geometry compared to the genes you might have seen, genes in bacteria, or the typical representations in textbooks. And so I just wanted to emphasize that here, that the mean length of the primary transcript prior to splicing of a human gene is at least 30,000 bases long. They're typically 8 to 10 or more exons. The exons are much, much smaller than the introns. So here, below here, I've drawn this to scale, and you can see the exons are about 150, the introns 10 to 20 times as big. Basically the lack of clarity on exactly where the information is in the transcript that the splicing machinery uses leads to a number of interesting computational challenges. And I've broken them into sort of 3 challenges here, which I'll describe: the constitutive splicing code, the splicing phenotypes of genetic variants, which has a very practical application, and the alternative splicing code. And I should emphasize that all of these codes have lots of interesting practical applications. Okay. So the constitutive splicing code is sort of the simplest to describe. It is to predict the predominant splicing pattern of a human primary transcript using the same information used by the splicing machinery. So we're given a sequence of length, roughly 30,000 bases long of A's, C's, G's, and T's. And then we want to predict the coordinates of all these exons. So the first exon starts at base 1, but where does it end? Where does the second exon begin and end, and so forth. And it has to be to nucleotide precision, because being off by even a single base will throw off the reading frame and potentially produce the wrong proteins. And so, of course, this assumes that the gene produces a single or predominant mRNA isoform in all cells, which is true for some genes. Okay. But very importantly, the algorithms that are developed in this project, it is sort of our goal here is that they should involve interpretable components and rules when possible. So they should involve particular motifs that have a function at the RNA level, perhaps being recognized by particular protein factors. That factor should be represented in some form in the algorithm. There might be combinatorial effects. If you have this factor plus this factor, then it recruits a U1 SNRP, whatever. There could be distance constraints and so forth. But all the elements in these algorithms should relate in either directly or indirectly to actual biochemical components of this process. And I think that's really what's so unique about this particular effort here. And so this is true of this constitutive splicing code, but also of the other codes. So besides human, there are also constitutive splicing codes for other organisms. Introns tend to be smaller in other organisms, so that's why I've drawn a different geometry. So there's some differences in the rules between animals, plants, and fungi, and so that creates a whole set of related problems of varying degrees of difficulty, again, each of which could provide insights into mechanism and could also provide have practical applications. So what kind of data do we have available? So Of course, we have the human genome sequence. There are roughly 20,000 protein coding genes in the human genome. For most of them, a predominant splicing pattern can be identified. And so we can construct data sets for training and testing of algorithms consisting of, on the order of 10,000 genes. The genes vary in size from about 1,000 bases to 100,000 or more. Again, about a dozen exons per gene, roughly. And so we can sort of make a training set that has 100,000 exons and introns and similarly sized test sets. And we have made such data sets for this project and have also been making data sets for other organisms, which are also being explored. So the second major challenge I'd like to highlight is the prediction of splicing phenotypes of genetic variants. So rather than sort of predicting where the exons are de novo, you may be given a particular, let's say exon 3 of this particular gene, and there's a known genetic variant, a position in the genome where people differ from one another, either patients with a particular disease or just natural variation in the population. So perhaps some people have a GTAAGC here at this 5' splice site, and then a rare allele is to have a T at that position, +5 here, shown here in red. And the question would then be, if you look at the motif for the 5' splice site, you can see that the G is preferred and the T is not preferred. So therefore, this variant would be predicted to weaken that splice site. But does it matter? Maybe this exon is sort of strong enough that it can tolerate that variation, or maybe it will completely disrupt splicing. And so that's sort of the challenge here, is to predict, will this variant cause this exon to be skipped by the splicing machinery, or spliced normally, or perhaps some other phenotype, some other splicing pattern might arise. So the NOMAD consortium, involving people at Broad and elsewhere, has sequenced 70,000 high-quality human genomes. And so these contain very large numbers of human genetic variants, 550 to 100 million common and similar numbers of rare variants. And so we have lots and lots of variants to work with. There's somewhat less data available where we actually know what the splicing pattern is. But there are lots of efforts to do RNA-seq on different cells and tissues of people with known genetic variants. And so there's starting to be more and more data available where we know the splicing pattern of both variants. And one study detected about 3,000 splicing quantitative trait loci, or SQTLs. And so there are starting to be sets of examples of variants that do affect splicing. There's also many sort of disease-specific data sets with typically hundreds of thousands of variants that are associated with disease, often by interfering with splicing. And so I just want to point out here that the most accurate available methods, both for this sort of constitutive splicing code and for variant prediction, use deep neural nets, like in particular this Jagannathan paper here, but they're not interpretable, and they don't really correspond to an underlying splicing mechanism in a way we can understand. Okay, so finally, alternative splicing is particularly interesting because of all the different alternative variants that it can produce from a particular gene. A single human gene can, in principle, produce dozens, hundreds, or even thousands of different mRNA and protein isoforms. And so there's lots of different types of alternative splicing, at least 7 or 8 that are shown here. The most common is this cassette alternative exon splicing shown at the top, where you either include or exclude the blue exon. But you can also have variants where you include a longer or shorter version of an exon, also either at the 5' splice site or at the 3' splice site, as shown here. You can sometimes retain an intron in the mature mRNA, and there are more complicated patterns in which you have mutually exclusive inclusion of 2 or more different alternative exons. These types down here also are quite common, but they involve some components that are a bit outside of splicing that involve alternative promoters or alternative cleavage and polymorylation, and so that doesn't fit within the scope of this project as currently conceived, but could be an interesting follow-up investigation. Okay, so the alternative splicing code, just to sort of define it more precisely, is to predict the set of alternative mRNA isoforms expressed by a gene and their relative abundance, which we often in the field call psi values for percent spliced in values. So what percentage of the time is the red exon included in mRNAs, for example, or if there are 3 different isoforms, what is the relative abundance of each of those 3 isoforms? And again, that can vary for different cell and tissue types or developmental stages or conditions and so forth. Fortunately, we have a lot of good high-quality RNA-seq data from different cells and tissues, so we can actually measure these things reasonably accurately. And you can think of 2 different versions of this alternative splicing code problem. You can predict the isoforms from scratch, so just, again, like the constitutive code, just start from primary transcript and predict those isoforms. Or perhaps we could think of an easier version where you're given the set of isoforms, maybe we discover them by RNA-seq, and the challenge is to predict their relative abundance, or which ones will tend to increase in abundance in one cell type or another, or in disease versus health, and so forth. And there's some nice work from Brendan Fry and others at the University of Toronto on this problem. So examples of differential alternative splicing include predicting variants that differ, or exons and isoforms that differ between different tissues, such as brain and liver, between different disease states, such as cancer versus normal. Splicing changes a lot during development. That's also interesting. There's even differences in splicing between in male and female, for example. So what data do we have available? So the GTEx consortium has produced lots of high quality RNA-seq data from human tissues that we can use for this project. Can estimate mRNA isoform levels for most genes. And there's also lots of data from ENCODE and other sources. I just want to finish by just mentioning there's also quite a bit of information from the recent ENCODE phase 3 project that focused on RNA binding proteins that my lab was involved in, together with Jean Yo, Brent Gravely, Eric Lecrier, and Jiandong Fu. And these are different types of data that are often related to RNA splicing. So we've done in vitro studies of splicing proteins, what motifs do they bind in vitro. Jean Yo's lab has found where they bind in the transcriptome using a cross-linking approach. Brent Gravely's lab has done a knockdown approach where it interferes with the function of the protein and then looks to see what splicing changes by RNA-seq and so forth. And so these data can also enrich some of these models. So we're looking forward to continuing to collaborate with this talented group. I'll stop there and be happy to take questions.
Thank you. So the strategy for questions. So our plan is that we're going to break for, I guess at this point it's going to be until basically 3:50, and the idea is that we're going to go on breakout groups where people can talk to each other about the talks and about what has been covered and sort of distill some good questions. And then at 3:50 we're going to come back to a panel where you're going to be able to ask further questions about some of the topics that have been discussed over these past 3 talks. So with that, let me, we're also going to stop streaming at this point. So point of view of the technique as well as from the point of view of the application. What would success look like in terms of tools? What would be a desirable tool from, for example, from the point of view of these of the biology application that So, for example, right now for deep learning, we have a range of frameworks from PyTorch, TensorFlow that kind of provide this promise that, look, you're going to give me you tell me what the architecture is, I will find you all the parameters, and I will give you a function that more or less does what you want. So, would something that has the same interface, but that where the models are more interpretable, be enough, or do we want more?
So I can try to take that question unless anybody else would like to.
Go for it.
Okay. Yeah, so I think that what we really want in the long run is something that is not fully automatic, but it is very general, right? So we shouldn't have just a boutique system that does neurosymbolic learning for, let's say, biology, and then another boutique system for cognitive science, and so on and so forth. Instead, we should try to come up with a programming framework which has a set of clean abstractions built in. So what could that look like? If you, in many of the talks that we had today, some uniform principles began emerging. There are these neural modules, there are symbolic modules, and there are many ways to bring them together, but there are some patterns already that are pretty common. So one could imagine a library in which there are some of these common forms of composition are just already there for you implemented, and it's easy to come up with new compositions. And likewise, there's also a suite of algorithms that are there to do the symbolic part of the thing. The thing about something like PyTorch is that it's really just it's a very general framework, but it's really just one algorithm that it's implementing. It's automatic differentiation and SGD. For us, it's not going to be just a single optimization algorithm. It's going to be a range of different kinds of search strategies using possibly solvers or enumeration or neural policies and so on and so forth. So we shouldn't try to automate all of that. We should instead make it easy to design new algorithms and put them in the library and use them as tactics while we are doing this larger analytics process in one of these domains.
I guess if I can add a little bit to that. So I do agree to some extent, though. I mean, I think one thing that really I think what makes deep learning so powerful is the fact that there is just one algorithm that works phenomenally well, right? Stochastic gradient descent. And I think, if we can come up with something, a very general purpose algorithm that works, then that would be, or even just a small number. So I think my hope for what will come out of this is that, there will be a small number of algorithms that turn out to work very well generally across a lot of these domains. Of course, if that happens, that remains to be seen. But I think things like stochastic search, there are these algorithms that have a lot of potential, and we've used them across a lot of domains that they're not the best. They're not you can do better by using more domain-specific algorithms. But I think they are very general purpose tools. And if we can have really good implementations, really fast implementations, and that are very general purpose, I think that would be really helpful for kind of moving the field forward.
Yeah, so we definitely want, in my opinion, very general purpose implementations, but I don't know that there would be just one, right? Because even if you think of numerical optimization, yes, it turns out that in deep learning, that one algorithm worked amazingly well. But if you look at other applications of optimization, there are many algorithms out there that are used. And I just feel that combinatorial optimization is so hard that just one algorithm for everything may not work out.
So here's another question. So there is a tension. So for example, in one of the hallmarks of deep learning is the fact that you can let the data speak for itself. You have relatively little prior knowledge encoded into the system, especially compared with older feature-based methods, right? And that has lots of advantages in the way that you're able to potentially discover things that you didn't even know that you didn't know. You can there's more opportunity for the algorithm to surprise you, but it also means that you can end up with things that any expert who looks at it would say, no, that's just wrong, right? We know for a fact that things don't work that way. That's clearly an artifact of just the way it learned things. It also means that you need a lot more data. So how do you see this trade-off being resolved, I guess, from the point of view of the method side, and then from the point of view of the application side? So do you see a strong distinction between, for example, things that if the model told you something, you would say, no, clearly that model is wrong. It's not, it's inconsistent with what we know, versus places where you would be more open to saying, oh, maybe there's some phenomena here that we haven't considered that based on what this model tells us we should look into.
Yeah, to me it seems like you want both. There are again, if you have this sort of a general programming framework in which you can specify different classes of models, constraints on classes of models, both semantic and syntactic, and you allow them also to be hard and soft, you kind of have the whole space open to you. I don't imagine that there is one answer to this. There are clearly certain settings where you want hard constraints, right? So definitely, syntactic constraints, because actually that's even there in architecture, in deep learning, because when you're defining the architecture of a model, you are setting some syntactic restrictions on how information flows, right? So that would be there here as well. But you could even imagine semantic constraints, like if you're looking at certain applications where you know with 100% certainty that something doesn't happen. It seems silly to allow that to happen. But at the same time, we should have mechanisms to specify incomplete partial knowledge. Maybe you can give a constraint that's very high level and that still leaves a lot open to be learned from data. But you could also perhaps allow for models that are just potentially off, right? They may be not be fully satisfied, and that's okay.
I think it might be as important to figure out how to interrogate a model and the outcome, to look for mechanism, than it is to actually build into the model mechanism. Because in many cases, hopefully a deep learning system will tell you, will show correlations that you may not understand is there. And discovering those would be a game changer in some ways in terms of understanding and then being able to convince somebody that this algorithm can be trusted. So I think that's an important thing to think about. In essence, how do you do experiments on the output of a deep learning system to extract information?
So are you imagining things such as counterfactuals? Like, let's say that you look at the predictions of a model. It may be partially or wholly neural, or maybe even mostly, it might have a neural component, it may not. But it produces some output. Are you imagining that you would be revising the model's assumptions and asking what would happen in this alternative world?
In removing or altering, in our case, splicing sequences in specific examples and saying, what do you predict if you take those sequences out with an established algorithm? But you'd have to do that with an informed eye. because it's hard to be, you can't do everything. There's too much space there. And train on specific subsets and say, what's different between this and what comes out of a more broadly trained process? Does training on a specific subset identify elements that are different in that subset, and that's why they're of interest?
Yeah, let me raise a related point here. So it's possible that you guys might be able to come up with, let's say, a few dozen algorithms that all predict splicing, very accurately in a particular organism or something. And then I think the question would, but maybe, so the question would be, how do we tease out like causality from that? Do we try to look at what's in the core of all of them, or can we, I don't know how to really address that question, because at the end of the day, or do we try to then design, experiments that will distinguish between those different algorithms or something like that? Maybe we could find sequences, they all agree on this set of sequences, but we could find a sequence where they would differ, and then do that experiment or something like that. That might be interesting.
Yeah, the need for causal reasoning came out in Armando's talk earlier today, but we haven't yet actively started looking into causality, but it seems like that's an especially important consideration in this scientific setting.
Yeah. And yeah, I do think a very important part of that will be kind of figuring out ways to actively experiment. Because right now, the neural network is just a predictive model. It can't tell us like, what is the one piece of information that you can add that'll help it disentangle? So I think help it disentangle the true model. And I think that is a very promising thing that I think programs will be able to handle that current techniques cannot.
It seems that in this context also, for example, having the, if you build models for different organisms, right? One of the things that is hard to do if the model is a full neural network is to understand exactly what it is that is different from one organism to the next, right? And what makes the organisms different. And it might be that even though the full model is quite complex, that delta might itself be much simpler to explain. So let's see.
Yeah, the delta could.
Armando, were you asking a question?
Oh no, go ahead.
Oh, okay, so I think Chris was saying something about.
Oh yeah, I wasn't sure if I wasn't sure if Armando was directing it to someone else, but. I just want to say that with the delta, I just want to pick up on Armando's comment about the delta, the difference between two different organisms, because we know in some cases that a particular organism has gained a new splicing factor or lost a particular splicing factor, and so that that could there could be sort of helping to understand how the whole process evolves and what types of changes in the entire system can happen or have happened. That could be interesting as well. So.
Right, and the way in which these hybrid models can help potentially is that because they are more compositional in nature, you could imagine pointing to some very specific modules that you believe are responsible for that extra factor that has been picked up.
Yeah, and that's even doable. You can then go in and delete that gene that you think might be, or try to even add a protein to an organism that's not normally there from some other organism. Like these kinds of things a lot of these things are experimentally tractable, and if they're well motivated enough, then we're happy to do those experiments. Yeah.
Yeah, interestingly, in the programming languages world, there has been a lot of work on localizing the responsibility for various sorts of behaviors of programs. So let's say that there is an error in the behavior of a program, then you try to point to the particular component of the program that's to be blamed for this. And then you can imagine trying to repair the program by changing that module. So one can imagine something similar in this setting as well, except rather than it being an error, it's just some behavior, and you're trying to explain this new behavior that has been picked up by evolution. But at the end, still the compositionality of the programmatic representation should be pretty helpful with this sort of thing, I would imagine.
Mm-hmm.
So let's see, Yisong, you had a question here. You want to
Sure.
Say it out loud?
Sure. I guess I typed it incorrectly. One thing that came up or struck me during the talks is that thus far, most of the applications, the scientific applications, is focused on supervised learning. So there's this ground truth label, and then all the input variables are observed. There are no latent variables. There are no unlabeled instances. There's nothing that you need to model in a more probabilistic latent variable sense. So examples where that might be interesting include like in the splicing application, where we want to model how the splicing mechanism goes through various transient states before the final product. But that's, of course, hard to measure. And to what extent is that interesting to the scientific application? To what extent is that interesting to the algorithmic questions that we're studying?
I mean, just to make sure I understand. So in the biology application, like even though explicitly it's a supervised learning problem, there is a lot of latent state or latent data that we want to model, right? Like the presence of the branch point and things like that. So is that what you're asking about?
I think I'm struggling to come up with the right vocabulary. Chris, Philip, and I discussed this during our breakout discussion in terms of like the transient states that can be measured, but we choose not to measure. I guess, so just to give you just a concrete example, in deep generative models, there's this whole emphasis on trying to discover interpretable or disentangled representations that have some not only interpretation, but then can be used to decode things. I'm wondering, and this is a somewhat ill-formed question, so feel free to interpret however you will, to what extent those things are interesting from a scientific perspective and also interesting from a machine learning standpoint. And I think this is a slightly different question than simply training a giant model on the raw inputs and then trying to interpret out things like branch points from the model or things like along those lines.
So Chris, Philip, what do you think about this?
I think, go ahead, Phil, go ahead.
So I think if you had surrogate markers that were known to be involved in the mechanisms that we know occur in splicing, such as partially spliced introns that are slow splice, fast splice, folded in different ways, and you could measure that and then incorporate that into a model build. They'd have to be consistent with the more general model. And if you could blend those two, I think it would certainly provide mechanistic insight. But I'm not entirely sure how you would blend those two from an algorithm type of process.
So I think what Yisong is talking about, these like intermediate states. So like you have the example of the branch point, which is not explicitly defined in our in the input, for example, or this example that Phil has been talking about recursive splicing, where you splice out this intron in two parts. Let's say you splice to here, and then you splice from here to here, and this is like hard to observe. That's very, very interesting from the point of view of mechanism. And the other thing that Phil was mentioning was the speed of splicing, or maybe the order in which introns are removed. There might be and that's something that we could potentially measure. There are techniques, it's not routine, but we could do it. And then we could say, okay, well, actually there's these 10 introns, and actually these 7 are removed first. So any algorithm that sort of has a dependence of some later that one of these depends on something that's removed later, like that can't that can't be right, or something like that. You could use it to kind of constrain certain the causal relationships that are embedded in these models, or something like that. So I think it's an interesting question, and we could try to. I think that it's hard to know, like, how do you, like, who should be working on this and in what way. But there is some data out there of this type. There's maps of branch points, for example. We can bring some of that in and share it and see if that's helpful for your algorithm building, or in some cases, people have measured the order of splicing, or at least the timing, how long it takes certain introns to be spliced, and we can bring some of that data in and just see if it helps anybody's algorithm building, that sort of thing.
But from the biology point of view, if you had a generative model that could generate new sequences and their corresponding splice sites, would that be of value?
It could be. We produce most of our more complex pharmaceuticals by expressing them in a cell line. Frequently a B cell, a human B cell, sometimes a Chinese hamster ovary cell. And because splicing, those genes have to have introns in them, because if we take introns out, they're less efficiently expressed. So there's a coupling between introns and splicing and transport out of the nucleus, probably translation. And so if you could predict a optimally spliced, precise, no error intron, that could possibly increase efficiency somewhat. Right now, we have a set that we know from historical reasons are pretty efficient, and we just chuck them into genes.
Yeah, so there's this protein, protein production for industrial purposes it's pretty big business, and there are, like, people worry about, like, what codon should we use for this amino acid, because certain codon are more efficient. But then if you change the codon and it's in a mammalian system, that might actually change the splicing, right? Because it might affect the splicing enhancers or something like that. And so there is some practical applications there.
But in addition to that, going back to that point of counterfactuals, to have counterfactuals, wouldn't you fundamentally need something generative if you want to explore what-if scenarios?
So, for example, exploring the effect of mutations to say, would this mutation break splicing?
Well, there's two ways of thinking about that. Every nucleotide that isn't used for splicing is a negative, right? Because they could potentially, if they had the right sequence in that position, probably be used for splicing. In addition, there's a very significant number of introns sequences that have been shown to be mutated in disease genes. So it's not a big data set, nothing like what nucleotides aren't used, but there are significant, maybe 500, 1,000 examples, maybe more.
Yeah, there are particular diseases, especially like Duchenne muscular dystrophy, and I think cystic fibrosis and so forth, where there are just many mutations known that mess up the splicing of these genes. And often it's known in what way it messes up the splicing. It causes an exon to be skipped, and that throws off the reading frame, or something like that. And so again, it's not it's not millions, it's hundreds, thousands, a couple thousand, something like that. But they are there, and that information, so then it becomes, I think this is more like what Yi-Song was talking about in our breakout, where like, what can you do when you don't quite have enough training, data, and how can you, sort of generalize? It would be particularly interesting for the variant prediction problem, I think, because there's some quality data, but just not really enough, or not. It doesn't seem like enough, but maybe it is. So.
Yi-Song, does this help answer your question?
Yeah, it mostly does. I mean, to some extent, my question was ill-formed on somewhat deliberately because I didn't have a good way of clearly expressing my question myself. I was just confused. And to hear different perspectives certainly helped. Maybe I'll just add in my perspective real quick after hearing everyone else's perspective. When we do generative modeling of like a picture of like a face, we know that there are eyes, we know that there's a nose, we know that there's a mouth, maybe some people have mustaches and beards, maybe some people have long hair, short hair. These are all things that, for people who do face generative modeling and face modeling, they've just built in. The entire industry has built this in. And people have like tried to extract out these latent variables that correspond to all these attributes. And we know that having a good handle on these latent variables gives us a more controllability and better handle on modeling faces. And so like, that's another perspective where, we could try to draw an analogy to the splicing mechanisms where in some cases the sequence splices early or late. I'm butchering the terminology, but those are things that we don't necessarily measure, but they could be latent variables and stuff like that.
Well, if I think of some of the models that Chris and Philip use, they have this stochastic context-free grammar model where again there is this hierarchical construction of a predictor. And that has at least some relationship with this face generation model that you were talking about, Yi-Song.
Yes, that's right.
And you can imagine more generally our work building up, richer knowledge-based models like that. But then that's orthogonal, I guess, to the question of whether it's for the final task is generative modeling, or is it just doing supervised learning, right? And it seems like generative modeling may be especially powerful if you're thinking of these, these what-if scenarios where there are some mutations and you're exploring the effects of that. But yet you don't have data for that.
I don't think it's just for the what-ifs. I think like the generative modeling, like what Yi-Song is talking about with the disentangled representations, these are really useful for understanding kind of, when there is latent structure in the data, and it's useful. And I think, I feel like these, at least from what we've talked about, these kinds of latent structures very much present in the splicing model. I guess to me, it's just a question of like you don't really know what you get in the disentangled representation, right? It's right now, at least my knowledge of the literature is that it's pretty hard to control what actually shows up. And I think the real challenge would be trying to guide it towards learning useful things that are actually there.
But you could imagine using a disentangled representation even in just the supervised function learning setting, right? If you have a program that is doing labeling, you could imagine the program providing these intermediate disentangled representations, even though the final task is not generative.
Yeah, I think that's right. It's useful even in supervised learning, because really it's just about learning the structure, and then based on the structure, you can predict the downstream thing that you have labels for.
Yeah.
Right. But what you really do want to get at is the structure. So I think the disentangled representations, I think, is almost kind of a getting at some of the things that we're interested in this project, right? Because we are trying to get an interpretation of what's going on inside. But
I simply meant to refer to the disentangled representations as an analogy, not as a direct implication of what we should be doing.
Yeah, so it seems like that's an orthogonal point from generative versus supervised, right? But it seems like generative modeling should be of particular interest in this setting because of our interest in causality and various other things.
Yeah, so we've been exploring generative models mostly just because that's what I'm familiar with. And and there are some nice things, nice properties, but we're in the last couple months, Kayla and I have been exploring a non-generative direction, and so we'll once we have that kind of worked out, we'd like to kind of present those two side by side, because I think there might be things that can be learned. A more mechanistic model that is more maybe dynamic, happening in real time, rather than the generative models tend to be static. I think I think the jury's out on what's best at this point.
So we are unfortunately out of time. So this marks the end of our live stream session. So I'm going to stop streaming now. Bye everyone who's watching us on the live stream.